about funniness, funniness is something normative. And we know that it's normative because it doesn't really track with a lot of the kind of descriptive things that we associate with it. As Good Charlotte famously said, boys will laugh at girls when they're not funny. And so, you know, laughing is something we do. Funniness is a standard that things can meet or fail to meet. And it is something like we're going to talk about it as meriting amusement. So, when we say the joke is funny, it's not just that it makes us laugh, because, maybe we just found out some terrible news, and because of that, even though the joke is funny, we won't laugh. But if we think that it merits amusement, then we will say that it is funny. So I'm not actually going to answer the question of what it means to merit amusement, but I also want to say a little bit about what things are kind of the proper subjects of what funniness is properly predicated. And I think I'm loading the dice a little bit for myself here. I'm happy to discuss this more in Q&A, but I think frequently people will talk about jokes being funny, and jokes are oftentimes types. You can read a joke in a book, you can tell a joke over and over in different circumstances. I think that actually it would be much better for us if we talked about events, particular instances, as the proper subjects of funniness. And the reason for that is that, well, I think it provides a nice grounding for funniness, and as you'll see, I think it'll let us do a lot more kind of theoretically. Okay, so here are some questions that I will not answer. I will not tell you what makes something funny or merit amusement. Well, what the reason is that I don't know what merits amusement. We're also not going to ask the question of, can a funny joke be morally wrong to tell? I'm not going to really address this question. I think almost certainly that is true, but again, I won't defend it. The question that I'm really concerned with today is this question of, when is it permissible to make a joke or a quip at somebody else's expense? And so when I say at somebody else's expense, I really mean something like, about like make a joke about somebody falling below a particular standard. So, if you fail to make a free throw in basketball, I can make fun of you for failing to make that throw. I can make fun of you for failing to look in accordance with society's norms. I can make fun of you for failing morally or in whatever way. The idea is that we're not really talking about cases where somebody is succeeding at meeting the whatever norm. And I'm particularly going to be concerned with this distinction between punching up and punching down. I suspect that a lot of you have heard this distinction before. It's actually a pretty new term, and the etymology of it is a little hard to trace. I think originally it is likely to have come from boxing. The idea is that you like punch up, as in like punch above your weight. And the first kind of more common uses of it were not really about comedy. They were more about, there was this article in New York Times in 2006 where I guess Keith Olbermann, who's a commentator in American politics, he was making fun of Bill O'Reilly, who's another commentator in American politics, who's a much more famous commentator in American politics. And Keith Olbermann ended up getting a lot of fame just for making fun of Bill O'Reilly. And so Bill O'Reilly would get really worked up and talk about Keith Olbermann, sort of raising his fame up, raising his profile up. And so Keith Olbermann reflected on that, and he says, you don't punch down. If you're in my position, you punch upwards. So he's talking about sort of taking aim at somebody significantly more popular. And then the first uses in comedy that we see are around 2010. So we have this, like, one of the first uses is British comedian Richard Herring criticizing a fellow comedian for making ableist jokes. And so what he says there, he says that there are no rules. Comedy, I feel, should be siding with the weak and the oppressed and punching either inward at the comedian himself or herself or upwards at the powerful or the oppressors. Punching downwards is just bullying. I think this is the kind of framework that we hear punching up, punching down in kind of regularly. You know, it's a new term, but the idea is quite old. Basically, look, cutting down the powerful to size is good. Bullying is bad. That's the idea. And so what we see here is that there is just this kind of amorphous principle working in the back here, but nobody has actually really in philosophy gone out to precify what it means to punch up, what it means to punch down. And in particular, there are kind of two dimensions to precify here. I mean, one, what does it mean to punch up or punch down? And two, okay, so what are the rules with that? You know, when we say don't punch down, is that a categorical prescription? How does it interact with other principles? None of that kind of is stated. So my purpose here, I'm going to look at some criticisms of punching up, punching down as they have appeared in the literature in the past year. And I'm going to try and create a set of criteria to give us what I think is going to be kind of a workable definition of the punching up, punching down principle. So in particular, I'm going to be talking about two pieces of work. And the first is this book by David Shoemaker, which came out in May last year, called Wisecracks, Humor and Morality in Everyday Life. It is largely kind of a collection of a defense of various positions in humor ethics. And in particular, he strongly criticizes the punching up, punching down distinction. The other piece of work that I'm going to be discussing is also an article from the past year by Stephen Gimbel and Thomas Wilk called Joke Capital versus Punching Up, Punching Down. And here also they take aim at the punching up, punching down distinction, lodge a bunch of criticisms against it that I will be addressing. I also have looked at all of these authors' CVs, and I can assure you that all my criticisms are punching up. So do not worry. Okay, so a lot of the criticisms really come down to one way or another of saying it's just too complicated. And so Shoemaker begins with saying, look, the primary issue with the punching up, punching down metaphor is that there's just no clear ideology-free way of determining who's up and who's down. And he says, look, we all come with different ideological biases. And so how are we going to have a proper set of what counts as up and what counts as down? And he gives us a definition of ideological biases, says there are value-laden filters on our views of the world that we're committed to mostly on faith, trusting or hoping that they have solid justifying grounds, but sometimes unsure in our more private reflective moments whether they actually do. So something like strong unreflective commitments, or like value, like not fully examined uh, value systems. And so I guess the question I have in response to this first criticism is how we should properly understand ideology here. And I mean, one way to read ideology here is in kind of like classic Marxist way, where ideology is, you know, a system of beliefs that justifies uh, the rule of those in power, or the superiority of those who are in power. And if that's the case, then it's not clear to me that Shoemaker's point holds. After all, the punching up, punching down distinction has nothing to do with justifying the order. It is just about clarifying what kind of the order of oppression is in society. So we certainly don't have to take this order as correct in any way. And so, on the other hand, if we take ideology to be something kind of more colloquially, you know, kind of what we typically mean by ideology, of something like, you know, as I said, a system of values, then what Shoemaker is saying, I think, is probably true, that we can't spell out the punching up, punching down distinction, you know, without appealing to values. But I think there's no good reason that we actually should have a punching up, punching down, or any kind of ethical distinction that is ideology free. After all, the whole idea seems to be that, well, people disagree, and that makes it kind of importantly unstable. But Shoemaker does ethics. And so it seems like for something, when we're doing any kind of ethical work, people are going to disagree about a lot of claims. And kind of which claims we end up backing up will, in part, sometimes depend on beliefs that we maybe haven't fully justified to ourselves. And well, what's the role of philosophy more generally? Well, so we can go back and we can justify those beliefs, see which ones are justified, see which ones are not justified. But even when we do, we still end up with a system of beliefs about value. And that becomes our kind of colloquial ideology. So I think kind of the ideology-free critique ultimately fails. Now, you know, the second point that Shoemaker launches at the distinction is that there are two ways to read it. When we say punching down is bad, there are two ways to read it. One is that anyone who is kind of lower down on the scale of privilege, we can never make fun of them for anything. That's one way to read it. So, you know, if somebody is, if you are, say, a trans Black person, then you can't be made fun of for anything. Or the other way to read it is that what's prohibited is mocking them for the features that make them lack privilege. And Shoemaker, I think, quite rightly points out that the first view is just a non-starter, really. Because if that were the case, well, as I just said, critiquing certain people for anything at all, critiquing in a joking form, would be impermissible. And we typically think that that's not the case. Very frequently, you know, people do ridiculous things. And it seems bizarre that we would be shut out from making fun of them just because they belong to a particular category, especially if the thing we're making fun of them for has absolutely nothing to do with that. And in fact, there are lots of people who lack privilege with respect to one thing or another that, you know, are quite appropriate objects of ridicule for other things. So it seems like what we should do is embrace the second half of that principle instead of the first. So that's going to be our first lesson for our punching up, punching down distinction. We're going to say one should not make jokes at the expense of someone for a feature that makes them lack privilege. And as once we have this, this already diffuses an objection to punching up and down from Gimbel and Wilk. So one case that they have is the case of a middle-aged white comedian making fun of Dave Chappelle for Dave Chappelle's transphobic jokes. And they say, because it is coming from a white comedian, it is punching down. One might, of course, argue that this would be an instance of punching up rather than down. Chappelle is an extraordinarily wealthy man. Well, maybe, but we don't have a clear and ambiguous hierarchy to which we can appeal to make this determination. Does the power of wealth outweigh the privilege of race? And once we have clarified what we clarified earlier, we actually see that this is irrelevant. Because the point here is that what is the feature that is being mocked? The feature that is being mocked is Chappelle's transphobia. And in that respect, he does not lack privilege with respect to being transphobic. And so because of that, this does not count as kept punching down at all. We don't have to try and figure out, oh, how rich is he? What are his other features? None of that becomes relevant. Actually, once we have this definition, Shoemaker's own point also diffuses an objection that he makes later in his own work. So, for example, Shoemaker says, what of J.K. Rowling, who suffered for years from chronic depression? When she makes her comments about trans women, is she punching from above or below? Again, once we clarify that what we're talking about is not somebody's privilege full stop, but the particular feature that is being made fun of, we can see that her having had chronic depression is absolutely irrelevant. She is a cis woman, and so with respect to the people she is making fun of, she's making fun of them, trans people, for their transness, and so it counts as punching down. Which he thinks count against the punching up, punching down distinction. And that is one, that power and privilege are always relative to a particular group or person. And so, I might have privilege with respect to a student, but lack privilege with respect to, say, like a senior colleague. I might have a lot of privilege with respect to, say, a young person of color, and then lack privilege with respect to a white man. And also he points out that power and privilege are always relevant to a particular context. And so in particular, we have roles that put us into privileged and less privileged positions. Now, he thinks that this makes it extra hard to identify what counts as punching up and punching down. But I think this is going to be really helpful for us. So our second lesson is that our principle is going to be one should not make jokes at the expense of someone for a feature that makes them lack privilege compared to you in the context that the joke is made in. So the context is going to do a lot for us. For example, another consideration that Gimbel and Wilk bring up against punching up, punching down is how Chappelle talks about the LGBT community. And what they say is, it is clear from the context that the jokes are coming from Chappelle's experiences of racism. And then, at least at first, there were explicitly jokes concerning the place of Black Americans at the bottom of the ladder. And so the first thing I want us to notice is that there is actually a significant difference to how Chappelle, for example, talks about different different members of the LGBT community. So, for example, his comments about gay white people is quite, or his comments about gay white people are quite different in nature than his comments about trans people. So when he talks about homosexual white people, he says, gay people are minorities until they need to be white again. And here he is clearly comparing the privilege of a gay person to the privilege of a Black person. But the comments about trans people have none of that. He says, I'm Team TERF. I agree, man. Gender is a fact. You have to look at it from a woman's perspective. Look at it like this. Caitlyn Jenner, whom I have met, wonderful person. Caitlyn Jenner was voted Woman of the Year. Her first year as a woman. Ain't that something? Never even had a period. Ain't that something? I'd be mad as crap if I was a woman. I'd be mad if I was me. If I was in the BET Awards sitting there and there's like, and the winner for the N-word of the year, Eminem, my man. Gender is a fact. This is a fact. So you can see there is a kind of attempted comparison to the experiences of women to the experiences of Black people, but he's not actually comparing here the oppression of trans people to the oppression of Black people. So I think one thing that Gimbel and Wilk already kind of get it wrong here is that when we're talking about punching up, punching down, we want to be very careful about how we individuate different identities. And so both kind of certain categories are going to have to be more fine-grained than others. And we might have to seriously think about intersectionality here. But this point aside, it's true that when he talks about gay white people, he does explicitly compare the oppression that gay white people undergo to the oppression that Black people undergo. And the joke it goes like this. Well, it's not really a joke. It's just he describes a case in which he was being harassed by some anti-fans at a restaurant who were taking photos of him. He got aggressive with them and they start entering an altercation. These other people are a group of queer men, a queer white man, and Chappelle, of course, is a Black man. And then as the altercation heats up, what do these white guys do? They pull out their phones and they call the police. And so Chappelle rightly notes that when the police person shows up, they're not going to go after the queer white people. They're going to assume that the perpetrator is the Black guy. But I think the context matters here. This is why we add it into our principle. So when he's talking about this kind of context, Well, in the context where you're fighting in a restaurant and the police are involved, and it's quite clear that it's true that queerness has more privilege in this context than blackness. And so I think we can say, well, when we're trying to adjudicate privilege between different kinds of identities, context is going to be the determiner. Now, one puzzle you might think arises here is, how do we determine the relevant context? After all, there are kind of broader contexts, there are narrower contexts, of like, is this room a context? Is the wider world the proper context? Well, I think we need to look at some cases. So, I mean, this is a bit of an excuse for me to rant to you a little bit about a fight I got into with a comedian on Instagram. So he posted this video of himself just going after this older woman, where he just starts out by going, "Well, you're really old, huh?" And just starts badgering her about her age, about like having children and grandchildren, whatever. And, she's responding to him snarkily, but you can kind of see that she's pretty annoyed. And against my own better judgment, I commented on that post and I said, "Look, man, that's pretty inappropriate." And he responded, "This was a roast show. When people came to this show, they signed uh they signed a piece of paper that I can make fun of them for whatever, and that there's a safe word that if they genuinely actually feel uncomfortable about the jokes I'm making, they can use the safe word, then I'll just leave them be." And she didn't use the safe word, so she was fine. And so it seems like, well, you didn't say that in your Instagram post. That seems like a very relevant consideration. And so it seems like in the smaller context of the show itself, maybe the joke was fine. Clearly, if other people are laughing and the woman is kind of going along with it, why not? But once he posts it in the wider context, that relevant consideration goes away. And so it seems like there is a kind of tension between what seems permissible when we look at the narrower context, and what seems permissible when we look at the larger context. Now, on the other hand, consider a case where, suppose you're in a room and there is only one man in the room. Now, typically, we might say that the man has more privilege. Certainly in the wider context, they do. But if they're in a room of only women, would it be punching down for women to make fun of the guy for something connected to his maleness in the smaller group? At least my intuition is that no, that similarly to kind of the wider context where, we might think that it would be a punch up, in the smaller context, this also feels like a punch up. And that feels like an important difference with the comedian situation. So here's the kind of principle I propose here. That if it's not punching down in a wider context, then it's not punching down at all. But if it is punching down in a wider context, then we need to examine the narrow context. Now, that's a lot of conditionals. So let us look at a little flowchart here. So how do we determine the proper context? Well, first we ask, is it punching down in the wider context? If not, great, it's not punching down. If it is, then you ask yourself, is it punching down in the narrower context? And if yes, then it counts as punching down. If it's not punching down in the narrow context, not punching down. So we'll get to some examples here in a second. Now, the reason I think that even though this is a little bit convoluted, this actually helps us make sense of another complaint that Gimbel and Wilk have against punching up and punching down. And in particular, they're concerned with the case of friendships. So look, special relationships affect what we can make fun of people for. And they say friendships are perfectly capable of crossing any divide on the great ladder of oppression. And that is a beautiful thing, something that is a precondition to humanizing others and establishing more just social structures. And yet the universal prohibition of punching down forbids this act, which is designed to accomplish the very task that the punching up, punching down ethic was designed to accomplish. So if you look at our principle, we say is, well, for instance, if I have a close relationship with my friend and making fun of them in a wider context would count as punching down, according to our principle, in the narrower context, given our friendship, it would no longer count as punching down when we make a joke between ourselves. But to kind of get an intuitive sense for this, suppose I have a close friend who is particularly clumsy, suppose due to a disability. And we're close enough that we make fun of each other's kind of quirks regularly. And suppose she ends up dropping things all over the place and I make fun of her. Oh, like classic Amy, always just dropping things. And we both laugh. It's not a good joke. Okay, I grant you that. But, ha ha ha, we laugh, whatever. In the smaller context, that feels fine. But imagine the exact same interaction taking place with a wider audience. Suppose, in addition to being friends, we're also professional colleagues, and we're like at a gathering out, and she makes the exact same motion, things fall apart, and I say, ha ha ha, classic Amy. I think plausibly, it would be a punching down kind of case. Because even though we have this close relationship, the context that we're in, even the narrow context, is not just us, but also the group of people who we are with. So this is our principle so far. So we're going to talk about, I think I have like 5-ish minutes, right?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So we'll get through these cases, and if we have more time, we'll talk a bit about a couple other things. So another couple cases that get brought up, Gimbel and Wilk bring up the case of Violet Gray. And so they say, consider the comedian Violet Gray, who's a Black transgender comic from an upper middle class socioeconomic background. Violet will sometimes begin a set as the female presenting Violet, and end the set as the male presenting Dorian. Are these jokes are there jokes that Gray can tell at the start of the set when female presenting, but not at the end of the set when male presenting? They suggest that, well, if we embrace punching up, punching down, then this kind of transition might affect what kind of jokes the comedian would be able to tell. Now, first, one correction. There is, in fact, Violet Gray, in fact, talks about herself as being gender variant, which I think is important for the case here. But fine. let's take the question is, does changing presentation change the relevant context? Once we've introduced context, I think this, again, helps us say when yes and when no. And I think it really will depend. So for Violet Gray, it is quite likely when she goes through the whole show, even when the jokes change and her presentation changes somewhat, it is very clear throughout the whole show that she is speaking from a single set of experiences. That she is speaking as, well, here are some experiences I have, say, when people read me as a man. Here are some experiences I have when people read me as a woman. And so I think quite plausibly, the the kinds of things that count as punching up and punching down do not change from the beginning of the set to the end. But there might be cases like, I don't know, and maybe some of you guys are familiar with comedian Nigel Eng. He's like most famous for his character Uncle Roger. And so he does these, when he does stand-up shows, he'll do the first half of the show as his character, Uncle Roger, who's supposed to be your like kind of racist Cantonese uncle. And then in the second half of the show, he comes in and he does a stand-up set as himself, as Nigel Eng, who's like, I don't know, a young Malaysian American guy. And there, both the kind of humor and the kind of relationship to the audience he has is, in fact, quite different. And I think here it would make sense to say that the context of the first half of the show is significantly different from the context of the second half of the show. And so, yes, I think it would be quite plausible to say that there are jokes that he can tell, maybe as Uncle Roger, that he can't tell as Nigel Eng. That would count as punching up or punching down in one case, but not in the other. Now, the other issue that Gimbel and Wilk bring up with the Violet Gray case is specifically that so the joke she tells goes approximately like this. She talks about, growing up and kind of being clocked as a Black man in Baltimore and being kind of pulled over by the cops because there's a burglary where the suspect is Black, and they start harassing Gray, and they kind of search Gray's backpack, and what they find there is a Dungeon Master's Guide and a bunch of Dungeons and Dragons books, and the cops say, "Oh, this is not our man." And Gray says, and they then give me a wedgie. So making fun of the cops a little bit for that. And Gimbel and Wilk say, well, it seems like the delivery of the joke as a nerd clearly indicates that Gray is a well-educated person, mocking the lesser educated police officers who get made out to be stupid bullies. So there is a definite undercurrent of classism and an assertion of the intellectual superiority. Does this make Gray clearly the victim of the joke, now the perpetrator? No, I mean, one thing that needs to be cleared up is that, first of all, Gray is clearly the victim of the incident, but not the victim of the joke. The joke was never about Gray being the victim here. The joke is about the police officers. And here, again, we can use our principle and say, well, okay, in the context, what is Gray actually making fun of the police officers for? Is it about them being uneducated and classless? I think quite likely not. And the reason is that suppose that she ended the joke like this. I was impressed. I thought they'd be too poor and stupid to even know what those books were about. I think that clearly hits very different. And that would be a joke at the expense of the police officers as on a class and education basis. So I think it's quite plausible that, again, the feature that's being made fun of here is not something that would count as punching down for a grade. And then this is our final kind of quote unquote difficult case. And Shoemaker really feels that this is an important case. And he says, look, one of the most despised and marginalized groups in many pockets of America and Germany and the Netherlands, etc., are white supremacists and neo-Nazis. Their speech is restricted in academia and most businesses. Their rallies are heavily protested these days. Their members are excluded from a wide variety of jobs, and they are occasionally attacked in broad daylight by those who hate them for who they are. The actual punch looks horizontal. And so, of course, he's using this case to, again, justify that his worry that if we were actually going to talk about a proper scale of oppression, the punching up, punching down principle would not give us the kind of results we actually want, because then we wouldn't be able to make fun of Nazis. Now, I think that there is a direct answer here, because being hated is just not the same thing as being oppressed. And so when we're talking about punching up, punching down, we're talking about oppression. And that is essentially something that has to do with justice. So if you're oppressed, you are a victim of injustice. Somebody who is just hated for their character is not somebody who is being treated unjustly. And so that is simply a character judgment. Now, again, you might worry, wait, am I bringing in all of my ideology here? But I think the same comments that I made earlier still hold. That if we're going to be doing any ethics at all, we have to grant that there are genuine facts about injustice, and they're going to be the ones that are going to determine what the punch, like what features one will have, or one will lack or have privilege with respect to, and what features have nothing to do with oppression, are about just being hated. Okay, so I think it makes sense to finish here. If we want to, eventually, if we had had time, I would have liked to critique the ideas that these two philosophers put forward instead of punching up, punching down. I'm happy to answer questions about that. But the only kind of important point that comes out of that is that I do ultimately think that once we get a precise statement of a punching up, punching down distinction, a lot of criticisms come from assuming that this is going to be the only principle that guides our humor ethics. And I think very clearly that is not the case. If only because even just thinking about punching up, punching down, we might also wonder, well, how hard is the punch? That's another consideration that is clearly relevant. So, for example, suppose you're in middle school and the mean girl, the mean popular girl is making fun of you for your pigtails, and you do in fact lack privilege with respect to her, and so making fun of her for her whatever is not going to be punching down. I think it is still inappropriate for you to start making fun of her that her parents are getting divorced because of her. that's too harsh of a punch, even if it's punching up. So I think punching up, punching down ultimately is only one out of many principles. And now that we have a precise statement of it, I think we can move on and create a better system of humor ethics. Yay.
Hey, have a question? Raise your hand. We'll start with Jesse. Hands up. Yeah, sort of two questions. Okay. So, we were taking like comedy too literally.
Okay.
I think like jokes aren't aimed at like making true statements. It's not the goal of being funny. Um, they're just trying to make people laugh. They're not in the game of saying true or false things about the world. They're more they don't care about the falsity at all. Even like racial jokes, they wouldn't even be jokes. We took them literally. They'd be hate speech. Get the joke, you know, they're sort of saying something false or exaggerated. So don't really all jokes have this context of aiming at funny, not truth. Once we understand this context, they don't really even seem bad anymore.
Yeah, so I want to be clear that what I'm talking about, is a particular subgroup of humor, which is when is it permissible to make fun or make jokes at somebody else's expense. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that, probably a vast majority of humor is not about making jokes at somebody else's expense. But I think it would be, I think clearly there are jokes that people make at others' expense. And those are kind of the things that I'm primarily concerned with here.
So I have a quick kind of follow-up clarification. Like, so you've done some work about getting like what we're really talking about when we're talking about punching down, but like, why is punching down moral or wrong? You really answer that.
Right. So I haven't given any proper grounding for it. I mean, I think the most common explanation is that it is a kind of